All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Audio Engineering Society International Conference on Audio for Virtual and Augmented Reality. Really excited to bring you a three-day program packed with, I believe we have 33 technical papers, a dozen workshops, 3 keynotes, starting right after this with the first one with Brian. So thank you so much for making the trip. This is the 5th AVAR conference, I believe 4th one hosted by DigiPen, including, you might remember 2020, which was all in VR, but had a virtual version of DigiPen. We have, let's see, some of the logistical things. So we have food available throughout the conference. You might have seen the cafeteria next door, the Bites Cafe. Every day starting at 8 a.m., you can grab coffee, snacks, and that's available pretty much throughout the day, except right before lunch when they're setting up, and then 12 to 2 p.m. is lunch every day. This is a 2-track conference, so we'll start each day with a keynote in this room, and then we'll have workshops happening in this room and technical paper presentation next door in Michelangelo. The posters this afternoon will be upstairs in Edison. And upstairs is also where you'll be able to find our silver sponsors, Head Acoustics and HBK, so please make sure you go check them out. There's also a table with information about DigiPen. On this level across the hallway is where you will find the rest of our sponsors. We have Meta, which is our platinum sponsor, has a room with cool demos of Meta Quest 3 and Ray-Ban Meta glasses, as well as the audio SDK. We also have our gold sponsors, Brandenburg Labs and Treble, also across the hall. And then we have a group of companies that have contributed part of the MPEG-I standard, including Dolby, Philips, Nokia, Fraunhofer, and Qualcomm. Thank you. Also across the hall with some cool demos. Encourage everyone to make sure you check it out. All of that is available throughout the show, so you don't have to try and catch everything today. We have 3 days to check out all the demos and talk to all these companies. If you could maybe advance to the slides. Next one, please. I'd like to take a minute to thank the organizing committee. It takes a whole team to put this together. I'm lucky to co-chair the event with Lawrence, but obviously we had the support of a great team to make it happen. Also, we'd like to thank the DigiPen Sound Lab team, who is providing all the support to make sure this runs as a smooth event. You might see them running around with the conference t-shirts. If you need any help with anything, they're here for that. Also, of course, we'd like to thank DigiPen for hosting again the event. Also thank the AES for allowing us to organize this event under the umbrella of the AES. If we can go to the next slide, again, these are the sponsors. Of course, we couldn't make this conference happen without the sponsors and keeping our registration reasonably affordable. So thank you very much to all our sponsors. Now, continuing on the logistics, make sure you get the schedule. You can use the QR code on the screen. There's also, those QR codes are kind of distributed around the facility. Come to talk to any of us if you have trouble finding it, but that has all the information you need, including links. So something I did not mention is we have technical tours happening every day. There's the anechoic chamber that some of you might remember for 2 years ago for measuring HRTFs. We're giving tours of that facility. It does require signing up, so that's one of the things you can find on the schedule or at the Meta booth across the hall. Next slide, please. Some of our sessions will also leverage a system that lets you broadcast 2-channel to the audience to be able to have binaural demos. Thank you to Jean-Marc Jo for actually letting us use his system for this. So obviously the sessions that we'll use it will give you more detail, but these are the instructions. Again, there's a QR code to get the app.
Let me interject there. Remy, this information is available on stanchions throughout in the lobby and also on all the monitors. So don't worry if you don't catch it right now with your phone. And this is an app that you want to download before the workshop sessions, if you can, for those sessions that we'll be using it.
Yep, and of course, bring a pair of headphones with your phone. All right, next slide, please. So tonight we do have a sponsored social event sponsored by Reality Lab Research. It does require signing up, so that's something else. We have the QR code. Again, you can also go to Meta booth if you need information. It's about, I think, a 15-minute drive from here
it's
at the
close.
winery. So definitely encourage everyone to sign up. Just make sure you register before you go.
And again, that QR code is available on all the monitors. They're all on rotation, so don't worry if you don't get it now. But if you should all join us. It's a really nice event. It's a great venue, and that'll be this evening at 6 o'clock from 6 to 8. So I hope you can all join us for that.
All right. Let's see.
And I think that's it for our opening remarks. So I think we'd like to bring up our past president of the AES, Bruce Olson.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Remy. On behalf of President Leslie Gaston Bird, who could not be here today, she sends her best wishes and regards. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and Board of Governors, I would like to personally thank every one of you for coming here. I'd also like to encourage you to join the AES if you're not members of the AES. If you are members of the AES, how do you become president? I've been asked this a bit this past year, and the way that you do that is first you start as a musician, you become an audio engineer, you spend time at your local section, you get involved with all of those section activities, and as you do that, then you will become known within the community of AES members. Come to events like this, come to our conventions, participate online. All of those things will then lead you to becoming a Board of Governors member, which I became 15 years ago. I'm currently also the AES Standards Chair. Been that since 2011. If you've got interesting things that you think should be standardized, please come and talk to me. If you'd like to hear more about how to become president, come and talk to me. If you'd like to hear more about how to become more involved with AES, come and talk to me. I'd be happy to speak with you. With that, I'll pass it back to Lawrence.
Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker today. And I just wanted to start with a little bit of background. I know a lot of, some of you here are involved in game audio, but maybe some of you aren't. And DigiPen here at the Institute, this is what we train our undergraduates to do. And I just wanted to say that as a composer and sound designer for video games, one of the first things I learned on the job was that implementation is king, and I think if you're in immersive audio, you probably understand that as well. So my musical education and training led me to believe that my job was to produce beautiful recordings, but as it turns out, that's just the first step. The hardest part of producing an immersive soundscape for a video game is getting all of those recordings to play back at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right volume. And that's the difference between pre-rendered and real-time media, and it can make you think that mixing a film soundtrack is trivial by comparison. Our keynote speaker today, Brian Schmidt, is a 37-year veteran of the interactive audio and technology industry. He is that rare animal known in the game audio business as a unicorn. He's an expert in both music and programming. Brian is the recipient of the Game Audio Network Guild's Lifetime Achievement Award and inductee into the Pinball Expo Hall of Fame. If you want to hear more about that, talk to Brian at the break. That's, I believe, how he got his start programming music for pinball machines, but that's a story for another day. He has spent 4 decades as a game composer, sound designer, and interactive technology specialist, working with companies such as Capcom, Sega, Magic Leap, QSound, Sony, Microsoft, and many others. His deep multidisciplinary expertise recently attracted the interest of the World Health Organization's Make Listening Safe initiative, defining specifications and standards for interactive devices and applications, including virtual and augmented reality. Please join me in welcoming DigiPen Principal Lecturer Brian Schmidt.
Experiences. And especially for audio for virtual reality, I think one of the things we have to remember that I hadn't really thought of is that we're a piece of entertainment that delivers our content, the things that we do, whether it's through the technology we build or the music and sound we create, through devices that are centimeters from human beings' ears. And as hopefully we'll learn, our ears are pretty delicate things. So what does this actually mean for us as an industry, or in some cases as a society, to have this kind of entertainment that, again, VR especially is almost exclusively delivered over headphones. So what does that actually mean? So I'm going to start by introducing you to somebody else who spends a lot of his time with headphones on. This is a gentleman by the name of Patrick Zudell. He is a retired professional gamer. Turns out these days, video game players listen to their games with headphones about half the time. That's way up from even a dozen years ago. Patrick, at the ripe old age of 21, again, as a professional esports player, he makes his money by playing, or made his money by playing video games, and the better he does, the more money he makes. So he has a big incentive to make the most out of these interactive entertainment experiences. And when he was around 20, he noticed when he was lying in bed that he heard this sort of ringing in his ear, and it just wouldn't go away, and he didn't know what was going on. And so he went to Google and discovered that he had tinnitus at the ripe old age of 20. And putting two and two together, he believes that he became convinced that his daily practice and his participation in tournaments led to his hearing loss. In the particular game that he was playing, it's called a 5-on-5 tactical shooter. And hearing footsteps is really, really important. So he would crank the volume up in his headphones so that he could hear those footsteps that, right, how many of us have done asymptotic roll-off through, OpenAL or Direct Sound 3D or something like that, where the sound just kind of rolls off continually and never, ever quite reaches zero? That's how the footsteps were implemented in this game. So they never quite went away, and so he cranked them up as loud as he could, and that's fine for the footsteps until the grenade goes off next to you. So he was listening very, very loud for a long period of time. Now, he is a bit of an outlier, but a lot of people spend a lot of time in interactive experiences, and currently for VR experiences, we're sort of limited by things like battery, headset life, and so on. But I think there's still a lot to be learned from people who listen for a long time with headphones to these experiences. And one of the problems is that nothing in evolutionary biology really prepared us to need to protect our ears from sound pressure levels. There just wasn't a whole lot out there. So biological hearing protection above what 3,000 years ago was made really wasn't that necessary. Another way of putting that is nothing really prepared us for modern factory floors or amplified music or listening over headphones. And so there's a big, big mismatch between what we're able to do now and what we were actually sort of evolved, how we developed in terms of what was safe. And of course, with VR, a lot of these experiences that we're trying to simulate, we want to immerse people in experiences as if they were there themselves. That's one of the big selling points I remember seeing in the early days of VR. So you could go to a sporting event, and it would be just like you were there. You could go to a concert. It would just be like you were at the concert. There are actually esports leagues now for VR particularly. So we wanted to give people the impression that they are genuinely participating in these activities, and some of these natural activities actually are pretty darn loud. NASCAR. Watching from the stands can only experience a sound level of around 100 decibels. 100 decibels is really loud. As we hopefully all know, that's actually dangerously loud. And there, of course, have been attempts to sort of, hey, let's make NASCAR a little safer. We can make our engines not be quite so brrr. It typically doesn't go over really well. And if you think about it, think of our senses, and the natural one to compare it to is vision. If you were to look at the sun 10,000 years ago, it's going to hurt your eyes. I haven't talked to anybody from back then. I would assume if our ancestors looked up at the sun, it was pretty darn painful. And we evolved some things because we evolved in an environment where light could definitely damage our eyes if we weren't smart about it. So we have eyelids, right? I can close my eyes and the sun goes away. We have irises that close down, so when I walk into a bright room, my retinas aren't quite so exposed. So it's literally painful to experience intense light. It's actually more fun to listen to intense sound. This is pretty well established. Nothing, unless maybe your village was right next to a giant waterfall, there wasn't anything back then that really made noises as dangerous to our ears as the sun is to our eyes. So we didn't need protection back then for that. And in fact, it can be way more fun to listen to things loud. It's fun to go into a club or go to see a band play, and it's real loud and you can feel the bass. And one of the reasons is that it's not technically part of the hearing system, but the sacculus, which is in the inner ear, particularly likes low frequencies above about 90 dB. That's the thing that really makes you kind of feel like you're in the moment. And the sacculus actually connects to a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is responsible for things like drives for hunger and sex and other hedonistic responses. So it's literally, your brain will release endorphins when the sacculus detects vibrations around 90 dB or more, especially at low frequencies. So it literally is more pleasurable to listen loud. This is the opposite of light, where it's painful to look at the sun. So that's a problem. A similar response, by the way, is invoked if you're like swinging or bungee jumping, or if you're chanting in a crowd, like imagine a soccer stadium where you have a loud crowd chanting. And sports and loud crowds are a big thing. I was at this game. This was from a Seahawks game back, the Seahawks here, the local football team, American football team, is advertising the fact that they are the loudest place to watch a football game as a positive benefit. And I can tell you from where I was sitting, it wasn't 137.6 decibels. But whatever mechanism they measured it, there was actually a big battle going between Kansas City and Seattle about who could be the loudest stadium. And I can tell you, there's something about sitting in that crowd, and yes, I always wear earplugs whenever I go to a Seahawks game, and being part of this group communal experience with chanting and loudness, volume. Again, I could feel my sacculus going, yes, give me some more of this. So no matter how much we know we probably should be safe, we're always kind of attracted to that turning up to 11 kind of thing. We can't quite get that out of our heads. So how do we as a society try to make it, let's say, given that there is this fundamental, it's not just being neutral, we actively are trying to go towards unhealthy listening experiences. And actually the very, very first sort of laws about noise go back to about the 6th century BC. Sybaris actually prohibited tinsmiths and potters from living within the city because of the noise they made. Now, this wasn't probably for hearing damage. This is probably because, I guess, tinsmiths must have been the ancient leaf blowers of their time. But it is, problematic. And throughout, for the last 2,500 years, we've kind of known there's a problem with noise. Dr. Fred Lithinicum from the Hauser Institute actually was one of the people who was measuring vets returning from World War II. And they all had this hearing loss notch, we'll see in a sec. And they actually thought their equipment was miscalibrated because every single returning soldier had the same hearing problem. Later, of course, in the 70s, the United States created the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Act, created OSHA, and later studies by an organization called NIOSH, which we'll get to, covered this stuff. And, again, fast forward a couple millennia after ancient Greece, and places like the EU actually start regulating things such as devices that are going to deliver sounds to people's eardrums. And before you know it, devices that people use, such as iPhones and Apple Watches and MP3 players, all have features in them now that help you monitor and help somebody know whether or not they're listening in a safe environment or not. And that's not a coincidence. Lawrence mentioned the Make Listening Safe initiative. The reason that those features exist in your Apple Watch and your iPhone and your Android device are because of an initiative created by the WHO and the ITU, the standards organization, started in 2015, called the Make Listening Safe initiative. The Make Listening Safe initiative aims to realize a world where people of all ages can enjoy recreational listening without risk to their hearing. The approach of this initiative is to change listening behaviors and practices through education and standardization. And a few years after the organization started, and they consulted with audiologists and medical researchers and device manufacturers and musical instrument manufacturers. All these people came together and they created the WHO ITU H.870 specification, guidelines for safe listening devices and systems. This particular initiative was designed towards things like iPhones and MP3 players. It turns out prior to 870, various governments had tried capping volumes, like make it such that the device could never be higher than a certain volume. That was deemed not to really be such a great idea. In fact, one of the unintended consequences is that recorded music started jacking up their perceived volumes by compressing and brickwalling everything. So that was deemed not to be good. But they did create the standard. It was adopted by both Apple and Google, which, if you're looking at phones, those are the biggies. Now, at the time, the WHO specifically left off interactive experiences. They just felt they didn't know the landscape well enough to be able to sort of intelligently participate in that. But they did ship the 870 spec that was adopted, and boom, now it's in your watch. So I mentioned Patrick Zudell, the professional video game earlier. I met him just over a year ago in Geneva, Switzerland at the WHO headquarters, where I was asked to be on a panel to help kick off the initiative of the WHO to pick up where the H.70 spec left off and to start looking at interactive devices, game consoles, VR devices, handheld devices. And so WHO and the ITU started their global standard for safe listening in video gaming and esports. Now, the title of that has been changing. We're still smack in the middle of this work. But as part of it, the WHO and so on has been doing outreach to the game industry. I invited the person in charge of that initiative, Dr. Shelley Chatta, technical lead for essentially the point person for Make Listening Safe, the WHO, to give opening remarks at Game SoundCon this past October. So we've been reaching out to game developers, both from a software developer perspective, but also a hardware and device perspective. And what we're really trying to prevent is this. This is an audiogram. I encourage everybody to get an audiogram. That'll be part of a call to action at the end of the talk here. And this represents the perceived frequency response of an individual as measured by an audiologist. If you have an iPhone and you have Apple earbuds, you can get a very, very accurate measurement of this on your own, on your phone. I had my ears measured by a professional audiologist. I did it with my iPhone, and it was very, very similar. So yeah, This notch around 4 kilohertz, sometimes called the Boilermaker's notch, because it was so present in people who worked on factory floors from the turn of the century on. In this particular case, it's down about 50 or 60 decibels, so that's pretty significant. This is considered severe noise-induced hearing loss. And the WHO estimates 1 to 3 billion people could be in danger of it. And it's sort of a ticking time bomb, because it's right. How many here remember when the Walkman first came out? Yeah, how many people are old like me? Yeah. Right, with the orange headset. That was about the first time where music became this thing that you just carried around with you and you piped into your ears. Prior to that, what did we used to do? We used to hang over at friends' houses and put on records and listen over speakers for the most part. But the Walkman kind of changed the way, it changed humans' relationship with how sound gets delivered to them, especially music. Again, going back to the Dr. Fred Linthicum from House Ear Institute, even back then, it was limited towards soldiers returning from war or factory workers who were in noisy environments. Now we've had this generation who have not yet quite gotten old, who for the last 15 years have been listening to music and wearing earbuds and large over-the-ear headsets a lot. So it's kind of a ticking time bomb. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about sort of the morphology and biology of hearing loss. And I'm going to give a big shout out to Benj Canters, who's a standout in this field. He won CDC's Safe and Sound Innovation Award for his hearing conservation workshop that he created. Benj got his Master's in Music Technology from Northwestern University a few years after I did. He's the founder of the Hear Tomorrow program at Columbia College. And he's sort of interesting because he did not come to audiology from a medical background. His background is as a musician, as an engineer. This is him in his studio he founded outside Chicago. He worked with artists like Pat Metheny, Keith Jarrett, Sonny Rollins, and so on. So again, this is him in his studio, probably 40 years ago now. And if you have very, very, very sharp eyes, you might recognize a bearded individual there. It turns out Benj, who I had not talked to in 35 years, I came across his name doing this research, and turns out he was one of the experts in what I needed to talk about. So it was he was very, very nice in helping me understand a lot better the morphology. So thank you, Benj. So this should be a pretty basic picture for everybody in this room, right? Sound comes into the ear, goes, reflected by the pinna, goes into the ear canal, to the middle ear, to the inner ear. Pretty bread and butter stuff for this group, I would think. I would also think a lot of us are used to these pictures in this room. I've been looking at these pictures since 1983. HRTF functions, right? And what stands out to us as VR audio people is, of course, hey, there's this notch at 6 kilohertz. And as I move the source of the sound in 3D space, that notch changes, and that's, of course, what we use to do localization. And what I never quite realized was that we're kind of missing, right? We get so seduced by these notches, right? Oh, let's look at it. And you can really kind of hear them if you really pay attention. There's another part of what's going on here, and that's this part with the arrows here. There's a big amplification that goes on as well. And that's just the physics of the ear, right? Again, yeah, pinna transfer functions. That's bread and butter of what we do here. But the concha is, it's a concave resonator. And it's a resonator that goes into a tube resonator, open at one end. And, of course, the concha and the ear canal and the torso, neck, and pinna contribute to ear resonance. And again, we've always kind of thought of these as the source of sound localization. But the basic physics here, and it's pretty basic physics. In fact, in researching this, I discovered that calculate the resonance of the ear canal is a very, very popular college physics question. it turns out we amplify, our ear physiology amplifies sounds really a lot. Right in that, 2 to 4 kilohertz range. And of course, what's in 2 to 4 kilohertz? That's the key range for understanding human voices, particularly consonants in the 2 to 7K range. Right, that's what lets us understand from a th and so on. And 18 dB is a lot, right? That's right. I think if you try and use the default equalizer on Pro Tools, it only goes up to 12 or something. So it's a big range. By the way, you can get another about 8 dB by cupping your ear. That gives you another 8 decibels or so at, again, right around where speech is really, really important. And as people have done real-world measurements of base of the eardrum, they measure anywhere between 15 and 20 decibels at around 2.5 kilohertz to 3 kilohertz. And all of that energy that's been amplified now by 20 dB by the physics of our ear goes into this really, really delicate system. Right? Same picture as before, but a little more detailed. Right, as we know, sound comes into the ear, hits the eardrum, goes into the inner ear with the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, the 3 bones of the inner ear, and that transfers the acoustic energy to the cochlea. And those are very, very small, delicate bones. Now, you've heard, of course, that they're the smallest bones in the body, probably. Here they are. But they are really, really small. In fact, the stapes, the smallest bone in the body, is the size of about 2 of the letters of the word liberty on a dime. Really, really, really small. And they're small so that really, really small pressures will move them. In fact, you can see the stapes is actually hollowed out, so it has even less mass. So it's even easier to move. Larger bones, of course, would be larger mass, which means our ears would be less sensitive. And I can totally understand why evolutionarily speaking, it was beneficial to us to be able to hear something moving in the grass that was still really far away and the sound was really soft. So our ears evolved to just pick up these tiny, tiny vibrations. And when things are this small and this light, they're also very delicate and they're very fragile. And so let's talk about how that happens here. So here's the cochlea on the left here. We're going to slice through it. And that's what this picture is the slice of the cochlea. So it's a more complicated structure than sometimes you think. And we're going to zoom in on the inside part and now look at this part. And this is where the fun stuff is. So as we all know, inside the cochlea, we have the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane is stiff and narrow at one end, and it's sort of wider and a little more floppy at the other end. Kind of like different tensions of a piano string, except it's continuous and not discrete like piano strings. Of course, as sound comes in from the stapes through the oval window, that is the beginning of the cochlea, it sets up a traveling wave. And the basilar membrane vibrates in sympathy. It's a sympathetic vibration to the traveling wave. Kind of like if I had a grand piano and I pushed the pedal down and I played a loud G chord on a guitar, and then I stopped the sound of the guitar, I would hear the sound of the sympathetic piano strings resonating. That's kind of how the basilar membrane gets its motion. And on top of the basilar membrane, you have hair cells that detect the sound. And it kind of does this frequency mapping where the stiff part is more sympathetic and resonant to the higher frequencies, and at the far end of the cochlea, where the floppier, bigger part is, like the bigger, wider piano strings, is more sensitive to low frequencies. Now, the interesting thing is that of the hair cells in our ears, there are 2 different types. There's inner hair cells and outer hair cells, and they have totally different functions. The inner hair cells are really the only ones that really give us auditory information. Those are the ones that, when they're activated, that's what leads to our sensation of sound. The outer hair cells don't do that. So there's 1 row of inners, 3 rows of outers. And we'll get to the outer hair cells in a second. So the important parts in this picture are the basilar membrane, which is that blue thing along the bottom, inner and outer hair cells, the tectoral membrane, which kind of sits parallel to the basilar membrane on top, above the hair cells, and then the stereocilia, which are what we think of as we sometimes call them the hair cells. They're actually the little bits protruding out of the top of the hair cells. And here's the obligatory photograph of the real things. Outer hair cells at the top, we have 3 rows of them. We have 1 row of inner hair cells. And they have different form and different functionality, which is why they look different, right? The inner hair cells are sort of eggplant shaped, and the outer hair cells are more tubular. We have about 3,500 inner hair cells, about 11,000 outer hair cells. And they're mechanoreceptors, meaning that they are activated in response to movement, as opposed to like chemical receptors or photons or something like that. So zooming in on them, you can see, it's easier in the picture of the outer hair cells, they're actually lined up almost like a little pipe organ, right? With the tall ones in back, and then middle ones, and then shorter ones in front. And this directly impacts how they actually work. So zooming in on the hair cells, as the hair cells move, they're actually tied together by these tiny little strands. And these are teeny tiny little strands. And that makes it such that when one of the hair cells bends over, it opens up a little window into the hair cell. And then in the liquid that the hair cell is in, actually has positively charged potassium ions. So there's an electric potential there. And when these little windows in the hair cells open, potassium ions flow in. And that actually causes a chemical change within the rest of the hair cell that causes little channels in the rest of the hair cell to open that let calcium ions in. And it's those calcium ions that actually end up firing off the neurons that make that actually send information to the brain. Hey, this cilia moved. It moved by a certain amount proportional to how open those channels are. So the more it's bent over, the more potassium, the more calcium comes in, and the more electrical potential is sent out the nerve fiber. And what that sensitivity does for the inner hair cells, it's in response to movement. So this is a map of, or a quick graph done by Peter Dallas of Northwestern in the 90s, of the sensitivity of the inner hair cells sort of on their own. And on the on the y-axis is the hair velocity. So the velocity of these little hair cells in micrometers per second, so millionths of a meter per second. So very, very, very small velocities. And the x-axis is the sound pressure level coming in through the ear. And so what you can see here is that our inner hair cells, which are the ones that we use to perceive sound, they don't activate under about 55 or 60, maybe 60 decibels sound pressure levels. So our inner hair cells are deaf below about 55 or 60 decibels. And 55 or 60 decibels is really loud. That's background, that's quiet conversation level. So what's going on there? There's something interesting going on. Let's go back to this again. We can see our inner hair cells are there. Remember, those are the ones that sit on top of the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane is vibrating, making those hair cells move. Nearby are the outer hair cells. And the outer hair cells are also stimulated through stereocilia, which are the fancy name for the sort of protruding hair cells. But they do not transmit neural energy to the brain for the purposes of causing the perception of sound. Rather, when they are activated, they act like little springs or little motors. They get bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller. It's in a process called somatic motility. So when sound is made, two things happen. The inner hair cells get activated if the sound's loud enough, and these outer hair cells kind of go into stretching and squishing, stretching and squishing, stretching and squishing. And that actually looks like this. There is a piece of, so this is, you can see the somatic motility of the outer hair cell in response to sound. There's actually some rock and roll playing here, which I was told was a smart not to put into the video due to copyright and streaming reasons. So just imagine your favorite song while you're watching this outer hair cell dance. So that's in the Museum of Portable Sound. So the results of those outer hair cell movements are essentially an amplification of the traveling wave. So it's a mechanical the outer hair cells are a mechanical amplifier. And it's that mechanical amplification that actually lets us hear sound softer than around 50 to 60 decibels. Not only that, the outer hair cells, unlike the inner hair cells, are not only bound to the basilar membrane at the bottom, but the tectoral membrane, that top membrane. And so there actually is a stiffening or shearing force that's going on as well, since the outer hearing cells are a little bit less fluid. And that has the result, when the outer hair cells do their dance, it actually makes the basilar membrane move less. And that increases the pitch resolution. It decreases superfluous motion outside the range of the primary frequency. And so you can see here, the red line on the top is what the motion of the traveling wave would be without the outer hair cell amplification. The black and white version is after outer hair cell amplification. And the bottom picture is just the same thing, except in 2 dimensions. So it's these outer hair cells that really are the things that let us hear soft sounds and give us greater pitch resolution. My dad was a professional musician for a long time, a music educator, so he spent a lot of time in band rooms. And he went deaf, mostly deaf towards the last end of years of his life. And he said one of the first things that he lost was the ability to essentially hear music. He could still perceive sound, but pitch became a jumble. And part of that was probably inner hair cell loss, but part of it was outer hair cell loss, which again gives us better pitch discrimination. In fact, they've done experiments where, not in humans, where they will chemically kill outer hair cells, and they can determine that mammals' pitch responses are not as accurate after killing off the outer hair cells. So this is back to our graph of sound pressure level to inner hair movement. If I then add in the results of the outer hair cell, we get this. So this graph here is the new velocity of the inner hair cells, taking into account not just direct motion, but also the amplification from the outer hair cells. So our outer hair cells are really the reason that we can hear as soft as we do. And if you were an audio engineer looking at this, oh wait, yeah, we are. You would say this is an upward compressor. So the outer hair cells act as an upward compressor on the sound, which makes softer sounds much louder. But the louder you get, the less amplification there is. And that's one of the reasons why people with noise-induced hearing loss, right, sometimes they will have problems understanding what you were saying. But if you try to compensate like this, they're like, whoa, that's hurting my ears, don't be so loud. They can hear loud sounds just fine, right? Their loud sound hearing is up here. The inner hair cells can do fine by themselves with loud sounds. But when the sounds are softer, now they can't hear. So it really, the first thing to go in hearing is dynamic range. You're really losing the ability to perceive low intensity sounds at certain frequencies. So Peter Dallas from Northwestern again put it as, the human auditory system not only detects extremely low-level sounds, but also operates in a noisy environment and adapts to respond without saturation to sounds that encompass 12 orders of magnitude in intensity. It's really amazing how this stuff works. And unfortunately, it can be really easily damaged because we did not really grow up and evolve in an environment where it was a problem. So the three big ways that they can be damaged is, one is those tiny little hair cells between the tiny little hair cells get damaged. They get cut through overextension, overexposure. So the linking between individual stereocilia can be broken. The stereocilia themselves can break, either at the base or midway through. They can become floppy, less rigid. Or actually the synapses themselves. It's called ribbon synapse damage or cochlear synaptopathy. And this also is a result of prolonged loud or soft music. In fact, you can have nerve damage, you can have cochlear synaptopathy without necessarily having dead hair cells on top. But since now the transport mechanism is gone, that hair cell is effectively unable to transmit things to the brain. And that, of course, leads us to these pictures, which we've all kind of seen. A nice, healthy set of inner and outer hair cells, and the result of noise exposure for too long a period of time. Cells die. They don't regrow. They get absorbed in, which is why you don't see dead hair cells flopping around. You see almost like little scabs that get covered. There's no ability to sense those areas if the basilar membrane is vibrating under a dead health cell. So we now are deaf to those frequencies. There is a little thing that we have called the acoustic reflex you might have heard of in response to louder sounds, especially low frequency sounds. There are actually muscles in the inner ear connected to the middle ear, the three bones, that stiffen and kind of mitigate the vibration of those bones. Unfortunately, first of all, there's a little bit of latency. Although they kick in after about 10 milliseconds, they don't fully stiffen for about 100 milliseconds. And they can only really stay tensed for a few seconds, and then they relax. So the acoustic reflex exists, but it's not really up to the job of protecting a human being from listening to music on headphones or listening to a virtual concert on headphones for 3 hours. So the philosophy we have to take is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, except there's no cure. I remember being in my 30s and thinking, by the time I'm 60, I'm sure they'll have this figured out. I'm 62 next month, and we don't have it figured out. There's nothing on the horizon that is super promising for treatment for lost hair cells. So now that we've got some of the morphology out of the way, let's jump into what the WHO is doing. The WHO has adopted certain safe listening principles, one of which is dosage over time. That is, there's a certain dose estimate of sound exposure over a certain rolling period of time, typically daily or weekly, commonly expressed as a percentage of reference exposure. So it's kind of like being exposed to radiation, right? That's a Geiger counter, except that we use a SPL meter instead of a Geiger counter to determine damage. The WHO has determined some kind of safe allowance, how much listening at certain volumes are safe. And it uses something called the equal energy principle to try and determine what should or shouldn't be safe. Now, the equal energy principle is fairly straightforward. It says that if you add up different dosages over different amounts of time, as long as the area under the curve is the same, you will get the same amount of damage. Now, short, impulsive sounds may skew this a little bit, but for the most part, if you're listening to an hour on Monday, 5 hours on Tuesday, that's the same as 6 hours on Wednesday, as far as damage to your hearing. And a lot of these things originally came from some work by an organization called NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. In the 70s, they did, late 60s and 70s, published in 72, they did a pretty extensive study on people who live in noisy environments, particularly factory workers. and what kind of damage was done to hearing. They had 4,000 audiograms collected. There were 1,172 were used. And they determined safe levels, assuming 40-year working lifetime in such an environment. And on the left here, you can see the data that they came up with. They determined that for an 8-hour day, 85 dB A-weighted over an 8-hour period with a 3 dB exchange rate should be considered safe for around 90 to 95% of the population. I think it was 95. The exchange rate, by the way, is how much of a doubling of, instead of a halving of a safe exposure time changes for every 3 decibels of exposure change. So at 85 dBA, you're safe for 8 hours. At 88, the safe exposure time goes down to 4 hours. Now, you may have seen another chart similar to this by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They came up with a somewhat more lenient version. And the reason is, and this is an unfortunate, you're going to have a little lesson in how governments work here. NIOSH are the scientists. OSHA are the regulators. So NIOSH is part of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. So NIOSH does research and education and comes up with data. OSHA is responsible for writing regulations that will be applied in the real world. And OSHA basically came along and said, yeah, no factory floor will ever pass if we require 85 dB at 8 hours. So the OSHA took the same data from NIOSH and simply said, well, what if instead of 95% of people being safe, we made it 75% of people be safe? What would that look like? And they came up with the OSHA regulations, which are 90 dB A-weighted for 8 hours with a 5 dB exchange rate. So it's actually quite a bit louder than the original NIOSH data. So you have to be a little bit careful if you're looking at this stuff that, one is sort of the unfiltered science, one is the science going through a practical real-world application. And of course, as I mentioned, these are A-weighted. A-weighting, of course, does not really take much into account at the low end. Low A on a bass guitar is about 41 hertz. That's down, 40 dB. So that data gets, attenuated 40 dB before it gets calculated. And there are some audiologists who think that doing the A weighting is even misleading and that C weighting would be much better, in which case the numbers would be even worse. So the WHO, from a recreational hearing perspective now, like as I said, worked with the ITU to create the H.870 spec. They adopted for recreational listening, not industrial listening, a 3 dB A-weighted exchange rate. And they created 2 different modes. One was for healthy adults. And it's quite a bit more stringent than the occupational. In fact, 86 dB for 1.4 hours a day. That's in contrast with 85 dB for 8 hours a day for NIOSH, or 90 dB for 8 hours a day for OSHA. They also have mode 2, which is for people with sensitive hearing, for example, children. And that's even more restrictive, 30 minutes a day at 85 dB, 86 dB. So those are sort of the 3 things when you're talking about hearing safety you want to keep in mind. You've got NIOSH, the scientists for occupational health. OSHA are the regulators that had to apply it to real live car factory floors. And now the WHITO, which are looking at recreationally safe so that more users are safe again. The WHO is concerned about this ticking time bomb of people wearing headphones for a generation. So the WHO also did a big survey and literature review of how people listen to interactive entertainment, which they published this last January. And one of the things that they discovered was that for people playing video games with headphones, people were generally listening quite a bit louder than would normally be considered safe. Again, if you think of the 86 dB for 30 minutes a day for somebody under 16, they're way over that. Again, remembering that every 3 dB is a halving of safe exposure time. Other things they looked at was how do people, playing these games perceive hearing damage? And unsurprisingly, a lot of them really did not consider themselves really at risk of hearing damage. They believed that maybe reducing the volume would limit their enjoyment, which, from what we know about the sacculus, is probably true. But half of all the respondents did express interest in learning more about it. Some other habits: the average volume setting was 56. 21% listened at above 60 or above 80, so that's considered high volume. Sounds were either extremely important or somewhat important or very important to 3/4 of people. That's good for us. We want people to think sound is important in our experiences. Unfortunately, time spent in immersive gaming is also associated with higher odds of some sort of hearing loss symptoms. People who played more frequently were found to listen at higher volumes, which of course is a double whammy. And a little under half said that after partaking in interactive entertainment experiences over headphones, they had ringing in their ears. That's back to Patrick again. Now, there's one big thing that probably everybody in this room is thinking. It's the elephant in the room. The last mile problem. We really have no idea the SPL at people's ears. Right? Despite the 870 standard, it being adopted by Apple and Google, we just don't know the SPL level. There are too many unknowns. What headphones are there? What are the DAC and the amp characteristics? Especially on a platform like Windows that have multiple sound cards and different chip manufacturers and so on. There may be multiple digital and analog volume controls. So a lot of the self-report survey results, I think, are it's a little bit challenging. Right, this is just an example of different sorts of SPLs versus input voltages. And we can, have the problem of overcompensating as well. This is from a random Reddit post. For about the last week, my Oculus 2 will not let me turn the volume above 67. I get a message saying that the volume is above the recommended levels and something about hearing loss. While I appreciate the care about my ear safety, my external headphones are nowhere near dangerous at 67% volume. So this is definitely a known issue. And the authors of the 870 spec did acknowledge that and look into it and simply made some assumptions with the understanding that it's something that we as an industry are going to have to be a little bit more careful about in the future. So it's still a big problem. It can be mitigated. Again, there literally is a new initiative that is looking at this. I've discovered that Dyson actually has headphones that will monitor the sound pressure level going to the ears, both internal and external. So that's the kind of thing I think we're going to be looking at, is the better characterization of headphones so we have an idea about what kind of sound pressure level is at the eardrums so that we can make appropriate warnings to users. I found this random headphone that has a built-in VU meter. Now this happens to be only cosmetic. I guess it's supposed to look cool while you're listening to something and having the little meters go up. But it is definitely being looked at. It's a new ITU initiative. It's a little bit less of an issue in VR, partly because our systems are so well spec'd. Right? If you're wearing Apple Vision Pro and you're in the built-in speakers, obviously those speaker characteristics are pretty well known, and we can do a much better job about estimating the SPL levels at ears. If you've got ear devices that match the company of the manufacturer, such as, again, Apple Vision Pro with Apple earbuds, we can guess pretty darn well what the SPL level is. But it is still an issue, right? You can always plug in your own headphones and so on. I was encouraged to see this at Target about a week ago. Kid-safe listening headphones that apparently max out at 85 dB. Of course, if you look at the WHO requirements, 85 dB is about 25 minutes per day. So even these kid-safe headphones are only safe for 30 minutes a day. There's another elephant in the room, which is, of course, all of the other sound exposure that somebody might have, right? If I spend my day listening to music on an MP3 player, and then I put on my Oculus Quest doesn't know about my 8 hours spent listening to music earlier in the day. That said, there's a postulate that we made, and that is that we can make a meaningful impact in an imperfect ecosystem while working on more complete long-term solutions. So as AR developers, what kind of things can we do? Are there things we can do that make playing less hard on the ears of our customers? And it's not really something we've given a lot of thought to. But it seems close to some things that we have worked on, namely things like accessibility, right? Loudness standards, we'll get to that in a sec. Listening environments, night mode, or compressed listening. Audio customizability, being able to raise the volume of the speech or lower the volume of background ambient sounds. Other sorts of advanced audio settings. So these are kind of cool things that the industry has kind of been doing already that seem pretty closely related to this stuff. A few years ago, the Game Developer Network Guild worked with Sony and Microsoft to help create the volume standards for console and handheld games so that across different titles, things were fairly constant. This is the audio setting screens from God of War Ragnarok. So all sorts of customizability you can do there. You can change, do I want medium dynamic range, low dynamic range? Maybe I'm listening at night or it's very soft, and so I don't want the louds being a lot louder than my softs. Or maybe I'm in a 5.1 system and I want my louds and softs to have a big dynamic range. So this kind of customizability in software. Devices are doing this as well. This is the Oculus Quest documentation. And it points out a visual alert in the event of high volume levels will appear. If that happens, lower the sound volume to reduce the risk of hearing loss. So the WHO and ITU are kind of trying to consolidate some of these ideas into the WHO ITU H.SLES, Global Standard for Safe Listening in Video Game and Esports. This is a draft still. You can see this literally is like 3 weeks old. And it specifies two things. One is for devices, and one is for applications on those devices. So for devices, the idea is dosimetry monitoring. Use the device, kind of like an iPhone or an Android device, to monitor weekly doses based roughly on the ITU H70 spec. For mode 1, for normal adults, 80 dBA, 40 hours a week. For kids, 75 dB, 40 hours a week. In both cases, a 3 dB exchange rate. Follow H.870 on the uncertainty of the ecosystem, right? We don't know what the headphones are, but we'll get in the ballpark. It specifies an interface with the principle that the end user should have control, right? We should let people turn this stuff off if they want. We want to inform them, make them knowledgeable, make some smart default choices for them, but if they want to change their experience, they can certainly do that. So inform, let the player user decide, and that thing should be on by default. A UI for a rolling 7-day recorded allowance using the equal energy principle. Suitable indication when the dosage is exceeded. Some pointers to more information on hearing health and safety. Maybe a point to an AES talk about the topic or something like that. That's a good idea. Information on safe listening features for the device. So that's kind of what they expect an interactive audio device to do. Messages as well, things like on boot of the device or when you finish an experience, like when you exit out of your virtual concert, give them some information on safe listening devices. Might be some notifications that pop up, and if you exceed 100% in the last rolling 7-day period, to let the user know, hey, you've kind of been listening a lot for a long time. Might want to take some action. There's also, it calls for password protecting devices so that parents can control the maximum listening volumes of kids. And also a headphone safety mode, like if you've got a Nintendo Switch or even a VR headset, where you now plug in your own headphones to automatically reduce the gain and have them explicitly have to manually copy it up. Again, partly because of the big variety in headphones that are out there. For software requirements, the philosophy again, end user has control, inform and let the player decide, and turn them on by default. The assumption is that interactive experiences are not inherently worse than linear experiences. There's nothing inherently worse from playing Call of Duty or watching Saving Private Ryan. However, a lot of people play games for many more hours than they watch movies. I'm not aware of any professional e-movie competitions where people sit and watch movies and compete with one another. It's an interesting business idea there. Also, the interesting thing is that the interactive nature of our software means we may, as people who create this content, these technologies, have the opportunity to have the content able to itself be a little less damaging based upon a user's preference. So user controls, monitoring, feedback, we have these sorts of things in a game where somebody watching Netflix may not. So the software requirements are fairly basic: warnings and notifications, category volume controls. So you can specify, hey, I want to bring these kinds of sounds down, leave these sounds up. The details are left to the developer. The WHO realizes that there's an awful wide variety of interactive experiences we can have, and coming up with a one-size-fits-all spec probably does not make sense. Then there are recommendations. So they have output level recommendations, kind of adopting what the game industry adopted for LUFS levels for authoring content. They recommend having dynamic range setup mode. If your application simulates tinnitus, like sometimes in a shooter game or a war simulation, a grenade will go off next to the player, and the game itself will create a tinnitus sound and muffle the audio. So allowing the option to cut that off, lowering the volume during areas of gameplay where maybe the audio is not critical, EQ presets, things like that, as well as the headphone safety mode, again, where you plug your headphones in when you were listening on speakers and it brings the volume down. And these might look something like this. So call to action. Here's where we're going to give everybody homework. As people who develop applications, I think we can do a better job being aware of how our users are interacting with our output, our audio. Are we inadvertently nudging users to unsafe listening habits or behaviors? The asymptotic footsteps comes to mind. In fact, in an updated version of that game, they no longer do infinite asymptotic roll-off of footsteps. They roll them off. Once they get to a certain distance, they just go off. So that removes an incentive for a player to crank it up to hear those really soft footsteps that probably shouldn't be there anyway, but the math said still were. So consider hearing health in the same way that we consider accessibility, as something to think about when we're designing our games. Also, telemetry data can be great. Play testing, audio analytics, all these sorts of things we can stick into our games. And I'll just dive in, since we're running out of time here. As an example, telemetry data. Right? As app developers and devices, we don't have to use surveys to get data from people for listening devices and behaviors. We can just get that data. We know what they're listening on speakers or headphones. We know what the make and model may be, if it's like a Bluetooth headset or a USB headset. We probably know what the audio output option settings are, so we can gather this data and use it to start to get some information about how people are listening. One of the things the WHO notices, first of all, there's very few studies in this area, and that so much of it is based upon surveys and self-reported data, when we have at our disposal a potential treasure trove of data we can get directly from our users. Another call to action, so what sort of features might I want to implement? Loudness setup, more granular audio sliders, HDR audio to sort of keep the soft things soft without the loud things being too loud, user education, all these sorts of things. Now for a researcher, there are a lot of, I can think of a dozen off the top of my head master's thesis topics. User behavioral studies, right? What effects does the authored LUFS have on the SPL levels at a typical player's ear? What about the logo splash screen? How loud, what does that being louder or softer encourage people to listen louder or softer? System versus in-app volume settings, gender-specific settings. Does dynamic compression make SPLs at ear louder or softer? So there's lots of sorts of things we can do there. If you're in the signal processing vein, are there psychoacoustic tricks we haven't figured out yet that give the sensation of loudness without the SPL? Kind of like the audio equivalent of shepherd's tone or phantom bass, right? How can we make things appear louder, feel louder without necessarily being so damaging? Can we detect impulse sounds in a certain way? Can we detect the ambient noise around us and maybe do customized compensations, right? One of the reasons people turn up headphones loud is often to compensate for loudness in the room. That's why it's dangerous to wear non-noise rejecting headphones on a plane, because the background image is so loud, you crank the headphones to compensate for that. Also, considering your own hearing health. This is a graph of a person's perceived audio response after listening for 20 minutes at 115 decibels. So if you go to a concert in the evening or go see a band play, the next day you're going to have a big notch at about 4 kilohertz, maybe as much as 10, 15 decibels, even 12 hours afterwards. So, next morning, after going out or after mixing all day, you wonder, why is my mix so bright when you come back the next morning? Well, it's because you spent so long in the studio mixing loud, you created this temporary notch in your hearing that colored your mix. So get your hearings checked. My favorite app is the Mimi hearing test. The WHO has one, although it doesn't have as many stars as the Mimi hearing test. And again, the Mimi hearing test if you're on an Apple device with Apple earbuds, it's going to be pretty close to what an audiologist would measure. So wrapping up, our ears are really complex, sensitive things that have evolved to do lots of wonderful things. Protect us against loud sound was not one of the things it was designed to do. The WHO ITU is taking a dosimetry approach with their 8.70 spec, H.870, and they are now working on a similar device for interactive experiences, including gaming and VR. The unique nature of interactive audio presents us with some really good opportunities to help gather data and change the way we make our content to make it safer for our customers, because we want our customers to be with us and hear well for a long time. And there's a lot of area for research potential. Again, our ears are marvelous, but very, very fragile devices. So definitely take care of them. So I think we may end up doing questions just in the cafeteria there, so I apologize for taking up the whole hour. But if you're interested in learning more, if you just Google Make Listening Safe, there's a nice treasure trove of data on the WHO website for the Make Listening Safe initiative. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all this morning. I look forward to a great conference.
So we did run a little over, and on the conference schedule, I hope you all were able to scan the QR code or get the SCED app. So you'll see that we have a half an hour break until our first workshop, which will be in here. That's Designing Immersive Soundscape in XR, and our first paper presentation, oral presentation, next door in Michelangelo. That's at 10:30. So I think maybe just Brian will be in the cafe next door, and then we can informally just do maybe our Q&A in that way, and I think that way we'll kind of stay on schedule. So thank you all, and we'll see you either here in the workshops or next door in the papers at 10:30. And the cafe is, again, open for coffee and snacks. Thank you.